It was one of the most significant campaigns of the 20th century and one of the most amazing physical feats ever attempted. Surrounded by hostile armies, 87,000 soldiers escaped and traveled nearly 6,000 miles on foot in just 1 year. It was a desperate retreat by the Communist Red Chinese Army under Mao Zedong from the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek.
The Long March must rate with some of the most epic military expeditions throughout history.
Many say it was a brilliant military maneuver. Others claim that it was a series of strategic blunders. While the facts are sometimes elusive, most historians agree the human accomplishment was astounding.
The ability to move that far in that period of time, I think, is one of the heroic military achievements in history.
It was a tale of endurance against overwhelming odds.
那个伞车看不到底儿啊，上面掉下去的时候听不到声音，好多战友也掉下去的时候。
For the first time in the West, the survivors revealed the story as they saw it. It was a controversial event that not only changed China, but the rest of the world as well. Every revolution has a turning point. For the communists in China, it was the Long March. April 1934, Jiangxi Province, China. Two armies were locked in intense combat. China's central government, the nationalists, had an overwhelming military advantage, and they were using it to surround and destroy their avowed enemy, the Chinese communists. On the verge of annihilation, the communist leaders were desperate for a solution. The story of what happened next has many sides. It is part legend, part mythology, and historians still debate the elusive facts. But on this they agree. The communist decision in 1934 changed the country of China forever. For the winners of this epic clash, the prize was immense. With the world's oldest sustained culture spanning over 4,000 years, this was a land steeped in mystery and tradition. In the 1920s, China was a sleeping world power, and its vast natural resources were barely tapped. 80% of its 450 million people were poor peasants who lived in the countryside. Of those, well over half owned no land. They often worked for little more than food from absentee landlords. At this time, China was a country in name only. Deeply fragmented, some of its states or provinces were governed by powerful warlords.
他所谓军阀呢，就是拥兵自重。他有一部分部队，反正3万人、5万人，他就不听中央的命令，他要自己为所欲为。
China's central government was run by the nationalists, who were also known by their Chinese name of Kuomintang. Their founder, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, overthrew the last emperor of China in 1911 with the promise to defeat the warlords and unify all of China. After Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, a well-educated soldier politician, Chiang Kai-shek, took control of the Nationalist Party. But rather than defeat all the warlords that controlled parts of the country, he kept alliances with many of them. The people most threatening to Chiang Kai-shek were the emerging communists. For years, young Chinese leaders were being groomed in the Soviet Union to implement the Russians' new system of government. Then they returned to China, and like the warlords, they established their own areas of government and power. Two of the most prominent figures in the movement were Zhou Enlai and a tall, charismatic young leader, Mao Zedong.
He was a very good speaker, and he would introduce humor and anecdote and he had all kinds of language that appealed to the ordinary person, not just to the intellectuals.
By promising to give the property of China's wealthy landlords to the peasants, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's party thrived in remote areas. By the early 1930s, the Reds had their own currency, educational system, and military army. Over 2.5 million Chinese people were under their control.
红军里边的小孩当兵的很多，背得强，大土豪，大军阀，给老百姓分土地、分粮食、分牛羊，红军好得很。那我说我也要打红军，他就愿意打红军走。
The communists and the nationalists both wanted to unify China, but the nationalists also sought to preserve China's social order. They knew the communists aimed for nothing less than a total revolution, an uprising that would violently overthrow the upper class from its age-old position of power and prestige. For Chiang Kai-shek and his army of over 1 million men, the Reds were a force that had to be stopped.
据我所体验，跟他身边工作多少年了，他是非常将实现人的意图，还是彻底消灭中共。所谓消灭中共，不一定把他人都杀掉啊，但是让他投降，让他服从中华民国政府。
The battleground in the looming civil war between the Reds and the nationalists was immense. Rising out of the east, dominating the continent of Asia, China was a land of enormous contrasts. It had vast stretches of mountainous terrain, wide swaths of rich farmland, and some of the most extensive river systems in the world. By 1931, the communists had carved out several areas of influence in remote outlying territories. In Anhui province, the 4th Red Army was in charge, but its days in power there were numbered. In the south, Mao Zedong's 1st Red Army held tightly to much of Jiangxi province. Here, the army protected the key members of the Chinese Communist Party. Surrounding them on the map, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists controlled most of southern China, but their influence on ordinary Chinese peasants was far more limited.
Well, the Chinese people never made a firm commitment to Chiang Kai-shek. They would commit to the general or warlord around where they lived. Many of them committed to the communists because they had a sense of vision, but they had no sense of the nation-state of China or Chiang Kai-shek as their leader. That affected the way he could use his military.
Chiang Kai-shek pursued the communists relentlessly and launched several major military assaults with the intent to annihilate Mao Zedong's army. But they were turned back each time. Mao's outnumbered forces prevailed with hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. The defeat seemed to make Chiang even more determined. On September 18, 1931, his forces were again closing in on Jiangxi province. This time, 300,000 men were marshaled to deliver a knockout blow. But on that day, China's fortune changed. Nearly 1,000 miles north, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded the northeast Chinese region of Manchuria. The untapped potential of China's natural resources had not gone unnoticed by Japan. The Japanese already occupied the island of Taiwan, all of the Korean peninsula, and some smaller parts of China that they kept after their war with Russia in 1905. While the Japanese rolled into northeast China, the world watched to see how Chiang Kai-shek would respond.
And Chiang Kai-shek immediately diverted quite a lot of his forces north. Even though he didn't actually use these forces to fight the Japanese, he stationed them much further north than Kiangsi.
The United States and Great Britain were determined to blunt the Japanese advance. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes were shipped to the nationalists.